In under 10 minutes. Okay, let's see if we can come up with and recycle some already existing arguments out there with a bit of my own takes to debunk 3 myths about sanctions. This is knowing the fact that we're talking about sanctions imposed on Iran after the nuclear deal in 2015, where the sanctioner and the sanctionee both negotiated and agreed on it. And then the sanctioner decided to unilaterally withdraw from the deal, even though the sanctionee was complying with it. So I will imagine that I'm responding to 3 different people who are all pro-sanctions: a democratic or liberal citizen, a Republican or conservative one, and an Iranian. So a democratic voter might say, I'm in favor of sanctions because it is the only way the situation for Iranians would get better. Sanctions would make the leaders comply with some rules that eventually takes the country to the path of progress or helps with regime change. We do know historically and politically, sanctions have often failed to make regime changes in big countries with strong leaders, but they've never led to a peaceful transition of power in the Middle East. Now, they have sometimes worked in small countries that, here's the key, internal conflict is already in place. Now, this is important because this means that internal conflict or social uprising and sanctions can make a combo for regime change, right? The US, after all, has shown a tendency to encourage or ride on social movements of rival countries or its adversaries through imposing sanctions and through injecting inflation to their markets. Now imagine you're the government of the sanctioned country and you know that the sanctioner is waiting for or encouraging dissent and the subsequent turmoil to then change you. You then take more preemptive large-scale violent measures to ensure any dissent gets crushed so it never gets to a large-scale uprising. This actually can mean that when you impose sanctions, crushing dissent and activism for change can follow suit. This is not about justifying state brutalities at all, but this does make you wonder, will sanctions ever bode well for the Iranians and especially for the opposition and activist voices inside of Iran? Or will its severe measures always become the go-to option for the government, since some sanctioner and their allies from the sanctioned country are kind of waiting outside, counting the minutes to have them changed for all the wrong or right reasons? If you are a liberal or Democrat, maybe you should be asking yourself whether or not I'm helping or hindering activism and democratic progress for the Iranian people by being pro-sanction. A Republican or conservative might say something similar. Sanctions will help with human rights and freedom of the people from the rogue regime. They might also say sanctions will help our allies in the region. Okay, now we have to be really careful about the word freedom here. Freedom will only be the right word if by it we mean more captivity and misery. I know this sounds bizarre, but let me explain. As sociologists remind us, sanctions punish the guilty and innocent together because of the collective nature of their operation. Because they tend to hit people who have the least amount of power and are the most economically vulnerable, they actually end up punishing people who have very little or no influence on what the government does. They also deepen inequalities. The poorest get even poorer by sanctions as the cost of health and food goes up. Now, it doesn't end here. Imagine a problematic government already fighting with or being complicit in corruption, now having to find other ways to sell its limited resources because some sanctioning entity has cut the legitimate ways of accessing the world. This makes the culture of governance to become murkier, less transparent, pushed behind closed doors, and further inaccessible to public scrutiny. So in a way, sanctions make a government act more roguishly. Sanctions sometimes pretend they want to change the behavior of a government to give its people freedom. Imagine that you have undesirable leaders. Say you didn't like Obama and his enforcing of stricter gun laws. Then imagine some power from outside imposes restraints on your government under the name of reprimanding it for such enforcements. 2 years pass, and you find it impossible to find spare parts for your car or to receive special medical treatments. On top of that, your small business fails because you can no longer purchase stuff from outside, because your credit and debit cards won't work, because your country has no longer access to the global financial institutions. And here's the twist. You cannot protest because protests, as I explained earlier, get swiftly crushed. Is this the freedom of the people from the rogue regime or a twofold captivity? This freedom-giving operation is therefore based on a myth itself. We are debunking myths for the sake of good thinking. That's why I think we should also wonder, regardless of the country, what is meant by rogue? Yes, rogue is the right word for a government that has human rights abuses. But Iran's neighboring countries, whose natural resources are not nationalized, which means are purchasable by foreign entities and businesses or by one family, do not get sanctioned for human rights violations, and I mean severe human rights violations. Don't forget, this whole sanctioning of Iran business does not go back to the Islamic Revolution. It actually goes back to when oil was nationalized, and precisely as a penalizing measure, since through nationalization, Iran's petroleum reserves were made inaccessible to foreigners. An Iranian in favor of sanctions would say this is a bad and violent government and we need the international community to help us with the situation. One other common argument is this: let the situation become so bad that it would trigger government change. I don't even understand these arguments, and I frankly don't think people who say it know what they mean either. Or they know it, but they're hiding their true alliances or intentions from you. Does this mean, all right, this is terrible as is, let the sanctioner get in and our lives will be better? Will it ever be the case that the sanctioner would say, all right, we come in, we free you, and then we go and we want nothing in return from you? No military presence, no military bases, no control over resources or your land, prosperity guaranteed? You know, just like how things turned out in Iraq. Or are we talking about how through sanctions, things will become so bad and resources will be so scarce that the leaders would say, okay, we're leaving now and we're going to give the country to its rightful owners, the people? Limited resources actually can mean more corruption, a culture of greed and individualism in governance, and a more exclusive access of the people at the top to those resources, which can also mean the suffering of the rest of the population. The fact that no government has been willing to peacefully go away in the Middle East because of imposing sanctions, and that the countries in this region that were invaded because they did not comply with the outside force or the sanctioner never saw a better future, make this myth a no-brainer. There's no historical precedent to corroborate this. And this makes you wonder, what on earth are we really thinking when we're saying these arguments out loud? Also, those who say this, and I understand their frustrations and share this feeling with them, forget that economic harshness and instability are not just about money and frozen government assets. In other words, they're not momentary pauses in the life of a nation. Sanctions rob a nation of its livelihood and health. While you are laser focused on the going away of the mullahs, the people of your land have their access barred from many things, from academic resources and spare airplane parts to vital life-saving medicine. Long-term financial insecurity and constantly facing frailty in every aspect of your life take a huge existential toll on the people of a land for generations. Not only sanctions kill people because of medicine shortages, they kill the soul of the people by exhausting it and draining it of its energy. But the regime is so bad, we have to overthrow them and then we'll decide. Well, your parents might tell you that this is what many said during the Islamic Revolution as well. And now here we are. So no, you need to be responsible for the myths that you deem as true or as justifications to collaborate with sanctioning entities. Myths that can be debunked in less than 10 minutes cannot be the basis for our causing harm to generations of Iranians. Finally, let us end with a metaphorical argument. Imagine Iran or any other sanctioned state to be an egg, with the heart shell being the government and the leaders, and the egg yolk and the egg white being the nation. I ask you, which one do you think is better? Letting the chicken hatch its way out of oppression, which means an access-filled existence to medicines, to jobs, and to educational resources, while opposing brutalities and political authoritarianism and trying to overcome them like any other non-sanctioned nation, really, and obviously with a lot of failures and turmoils, or being pro-sanctions while knowing how it leads to the crushing of dissent, to the draining of the ordinary and the most vulnerable of their energy and livelihood, and to creating mass brain drain. And if you choose the second option, should you ask yourself whether by turning a blind eye to the harmful effects of the sanctions that you're complicit in doing this to a people?